If you are a regular listener to the Sociology show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is Dr Teresa Crew. Hi Teresa, thanks for joining me.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself? Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So, as you introduced, so I'm a senior lecturer in social policy and I work at Bangor University. And even though I'm a senior lecturer in social policy, I tend to navigate that bridge between social policy and sociology. And I tend to, most of my time, I teach, but I always like to make sure that I keep in with doing research. So I always do at least one research project every year.
Brilliant. And we'll talk a bit more about your research later on.
Okay.
I always ask people how they got into sociology. Did you study it yourself, GCSE, A-level?
No, so, it's always hard to tell from voices. So I'm 48, so I'm getting on a little bit. And when I was in school, I don't really remember having that option. And I was a bit naughty in school. I used to bunk off quite a bit. One of the reasons why is because it just didn't really fulfill me in any way. So I actually left school with no qualifications at all, but I kind of knew in the back of my mind I'd come back to some form of education. And I just I looked at all the different types of why I decided to go straight into university. I don't know. But when I was looking at the subject areas, I looked at law first and I found that just told me answers and I didn't really like that. I looked at psychology and I found that it was too mathematical for my taste. And when I looked at sociology, I just fell in love and I thought this is the area for me.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people I've spoken to have said they kind of were always a sociologist or loved the idea of sociology before they even knew what it was, or they might have heard the word but didn't really understand what it was.
No, I didn't understand, as I tell my students, sociology is about the world around us, sometimes about the social problems that we hear about and, dissecting those social problems. And yes, I didn't even really know that this was a thing until I came to university and I thought, oh my gosh, they're actually, we study things that are happening, the world around us. So that's what I thought was interesting.
And when you started your university course, what were your inspirations? Was there a particular theory or theorist or sociologist, someone that really grabbed your interest?
So, what the sad thing is, when I started uni, firstly, I would say all I actually wanted to get out of university was to be able to read the Guardian newspaper and not feel stupid. And when I think about that now, that's really quite sad that's really what I wanted. A job was not really the idea. So once I actually started university, I noticed that theorists, I've got to say Marx, I really enjoyed Marxism. And then I started to, read up about feminisms, and I was just entranced by that because, I'd noticed things around me that I did not like. So Marxism, feminism, I noticed things around me that I didn't like, and they were giving me reasons for what was happening, and it made me a much more critical person. So I think those two, feminism and Marxism, those very two broad areas.
And I'm also interested, does that link up to your own personal background? Because obviously we're going to talk about your own research about working class academics. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your own background before you got into university?
Yeah, sure. So I briefly mentioned there, so, I messed around in school, and it wasn't due to not being able to keep up. It was just that, I don't know, it wasn't really, even as a girl, you hear about it's not very fashionable for boys to be academic, but even for a working class girl, there wasn't really the encouragement there. And that's not in any way to be detrimental to my family or anything, but I really, education wasn't seen as the way out. The way out is once you left school was to get a job, and very much like a manual job. So I'm very much from a working class background, and my family are still, and my friends are still from working class backgrounds. That's where the book came from. One of the reasons it came from was because, I still live a very working class life. I haven't all of a sudden entered this ivory tower and where I'm going to all these fancy dinners and things like that. I'm still very much from the background that I was when I first entered university. So yeah, that's how I'd see myself.
Excellent. And you just mentioned your book. Should we go into that?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, I've plugged it about 5 times.
Yeah, no, don't. Do you want to give us the full title to start with?
Yes, certainly. So it's called Higher Education and Working Class Academics, Precarity and Diversity in Academia.
Fantastic. So let's start from the beginning. How did it all get started?
So it got started. So I think one of the reasons it got started was due to my background. I was very much aware that even though I was supposedly now, I think, I was aware that I would be classed as a middle-class person, and even my friends and family might jokingly refer to me as being middle-class, mainly just to annoy me. They would say things like that because they just knew I would cringe at the thought of being classed as middle-class. But then as well, it was my interactions with students. I mean, I'm not just saying this because some students might watch this, but I love teaching. I love working with students. And some of the feedback I often get from students is the word normal has been ascribed to me, whatever that means. And I think it was because they find me approachable and, that they could come to me with an issue and they knew that I would just speak perhaps in the normal way that the mum, the dad, might speak. So it just came from that being quite interested in why I was classed as normal. And I knew it was not just about gender because, the initial thought was, oh, is this because it's about gender that, perhaps they feel comfortable in me in like a motherly sort of a way. But I could tell that it was more class-based because I had friends, working class male academics, who also had some of the experiences that I had. So I just literally wanted to interrogate that. I had no desire to turn it into a book. I just wanted to find out more. That's where it came from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Is that I do remember a student thinking I was really cool. So why'd you say that? It's because they saw me at the football having a pint. But to them, they were just like, my teacher was having a pint at the football. It's just because it must have been something so normal, and maybe their perception was that's not what teachers do. I'm not sure. Yeah,
that's not what we do. I think with mine is because I swear a lot. Now, I'm not saying that every working class person swears, of course, but I think it was just the fact, oh my God, she's a lecturer and she's just sworn.
Yeah.
So yes, I think mine was to do with that.
Especially, I quite like it when you make a reference to something within popular culture as well. When you drop in I watch the occasional Love Island episode or something. That always goes down well.
That is definitely part of my lectures. Or actually, in football is as well. I'm an avid, for my sins, Newcastle United supporter. So, right. So when I'm trying to teach, things like when I used to teach Year 1 research methods, I would use the example of quantitative data being like the football score and what that could tell you about the tables and things like that, and then qualitative data being the football match report. And there'd be plenty of people that could really understand straight away what was there meant by qualitative and quantitative, just by that very, very simple reference.
Yeah, agreed. So what about your methodology for your book then? How do you collect your data?
Okay, so it started off, as I say, this was going to be very, very small scale at first. I'd intended for it just to interview about 10 people. And straight away, I knew, I was not going to be able to provide a map of, I wasn't going to be mapping how many working class academics there were. It was just going to be very much a qualitative study. And I realised as well from doing previous interviews for my PhD that for a subject sort of as this, I need to do what I call as conversational interviews. It really needs to feel like two people were talking, and so there were ways that I could interject and add things, and it would just very much feel like a conversation rather than an interrogation, or, you know, as in even qualitative interviews can still feel very much like there's a power differential. And I really wanted it to come across to the person that they were being, that we were just having a chat about a subject that was close to our heart. That's how I looked at it.
Yeah, so kind of building that rapport and freedom of speech and, you know, not feeling under pressure.
Yeah, definitely. And building the rapport was so easy, you know, just because I can't think really of any interviews that didn't go well or weren't easy. And I think it was just that the way that I put out an advertisement for research respondents, you know, I looked for people who self-defined as being a working class academic. So they could see straight away that I wasn't trying to make a value judgment about whether you are a working class academic or not. It was just an acceptance that if they felt they were a working class academic. And I don't even interrogate in the book as in whether people are or not, because that's not really my place to do that. So there was very much a rapport right from the start. We were talking about some shared experiences, and sometimes if it was an experience that they had and I hadn't, there was no problem with that. It was just two people talking.
And were they teachers just within social sciences, or were they in a range of fields?
So when I was actually analysing the data, I started to realise that if I started to look at the different types of people, I would say 2/3 were from more of an arts and humanities background. So it wasn't just social sciences, but it was, you know, across the whole spectrum of arts and humanities. And then the other third were from like STEM subjects. So I think when I'm going to do some further work, and I'd like to focus more on STEM subjects because there may be some slight differences, you know, in terms of like teaching was one of the issues that people brought up, and maybe it's difficult to bring class into teaching. But so about 2/3 for arts and humanities, but that's across a wide spectrum of arts and humanities. So it wasn't just social sciences.
Yeah, and the reason I asked is I just wondered if something like sociology, for example, that naturally lends itself to more people from working class backgrounds because of their interest in something like Marxism and so on. I wondered if there was an underrepresentation in STEM subjects.
When I was interviewing people from STEM subjects, there was still a lot of the same experiences. The only part in the book where I say it started to deviate is when, so one of the factors that I talk about is that working class academics, they bring an awful lot about class into the teaching. And I just found that's where we started to deviate. But in terms of the same experiences, pretty much all had very, very similar experiences. But it was just that when I talked about what are the positive aspects of being a working class academic, I found that people from STEM subjects were less likely to be able to offer suggestions of what might be positive.
That's interesting. And you said they're quite similar backgrounds. Was it quite common for the teachers themselves to not enjoy their own education? Because I've spoken to a few working class academics, and they each have that experience that they didn't enjoy school themselves, or they dropped out of school, or they, like you said yourself, you didn't get qualifications at the time, that they often come into teaching much later.
Right, so I don't really discuss this too much in the book, but I do remember just like thinking about the data in my head that it seemed to be an even split. So of course they had people with a similar narrative to myself where they either dropped out of school or they didn't have a particularly great education. But there was also people who I would consider to have more of the traditional academic background where, you know, they did A-levels, they went on to do a degree and then followed through to do a PhD, and a much more neater way of approaching it. And I didn't really see that there was any differences in terms of why there was those differences. And I think that's an important one to note, actually, because when we think about working class academics, we tend to think of them in a particular narrative. The first narrative that I spoke about in terms of some troubled, you know, past or something like that, or difficulties in education. So I'd definitely say there was more of an even split. Not everybody had the same sort of experience that I had. It was very much an even split, 50-50.
So one of the things that I'm interested in, Teresa, is I've spoken to a few working class academics myself, and they often say that they still consider themselves undoubtedly working class, even though their job would suggest middle class, or they may have been socially mobile. Was that quite a common theme, that the working class academics still consider themselves to be working class?
Yes and no. So there was some difference there. So as in, I think when I look at the respondents, I would more than likely say about 95% did see themselves as working class. They did obviously see some of the difficulties in that term. So, for instance, they were more likely to have. So, as much as I spoke to, half of my respondents were earning quite good money. So they did see the difficulty with using that term just by going by the economic capital they had, but also as well sometimes the cultural capital that they'd managed to accrue as well. That became difficult for them to sometimes discuss themselves as being a working class academic. And there's lots of different literature talks about habitus, the way that, there is like a split habitus where at times that they feel that they're part of one community and then part of another. And I did even find myself when I was writing the book that it was quite difficult to refer to myself as a working class academic because my partner works as an NHS cleaner, and if you were going to think about somebody that's working class, I'm sure you'd put my partner as somebody who's working class more so than me. I'm much more privileged than my partner is in terms of income, in terms of access to capital, even in terms of the way that people treat me as well. So there was that I touch upon, that there is a difficulty when people refer to themselves as being working class academics. I think that even though there's obviously a difference in experience between my respondents and middle class academics, there's that sort of, you've got to accept that there is some privilege there in comparison to the typical working class person.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I spoke to Dr. Nicola Harding, who's just recently become a doctor, but she said she still feels she has more in common with the cleaners than her academic friends, which is really interesting.
Oh, definitely. And I would say that was definitely a theme when I spoke to people. And I think the reason why is that at times it's just a different type of communication style as well. So, for instance, when I've met people who I can tell the working class academics straight away, and one of the reasons why is there's a sense of humour, there's a warmth in the sense of humour. I call it that we just take the piss out of each other. There just seems to be that ease, whereas sense of humour in terms of like academic circles, when it comes to middle class academic circles, I cringe even thinking about having a sense of humour there. My sense of humour would not come across very well, and that's what I found. I've come across Nicola at a conference, and I know what she means. It's much easier to speak with people like us than middle class academics.
Does that become a barrier though? Because if we're still that kind of aware of class, and we still kind of see academia, particularly higher level education, as a middle class thing, does that become problematic, do you think?
Yes, but I think until that we... so if I give an example, so one of my respondents talked about being invited to speak at a conference, and the conference was relating to long-term unemployment. And one of my respondents' partner had actually been long-term unemployed. And the difficulty is, whilst we're still having academics who on the surface may not have experienced long-term unemployment, and we're not inviting people in who have that lived experience, I think academia will very much stay this middle-class profession. I find it quite uncomfortable when we hear people speaking for others. And one of the areas that I particularly noticed this, I started off writing about gypsy travellers. I was asked to do a local project, and I've vowed that I will not do research on gypsy travellers because it is always on them, like they're a subject. And I like to either don't do research on gypsy travellers or to make sure they're included in my researches somehow. And I feel that there's an awful lot, I'm going to sound quite harsh here, but I'm going to just say it, but there's an awful lot of academics who write about poverty, who write about inequalities, and I'm wondering, what do they do to actually change the situation? Do they bring in their research respondents? Do they help those research respondents get funding? So I've just got some difficulty. Until that sort of thing change, I don't think we're going to see academia as anything but a middle-class profession.
Particularly at further and higher level.
Yes, definitely, yes.
Thank you, Teresa. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we're going to talk a little bit more about your research.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Teresa Crew, and we were talking about her book, Higher Education and Working Class Academics. Teresa, tell us a bit more. What else did you find from your research?
So I think one of the maybe the headline findings would be about imposter syndrome. And what I really found is that it's not actually imposter syndrome my respondents were experiencing. So it's more about not fitting in and being made very much aware that they don't fit in academia in a variety of different ways. One example is about how a different accent. I did find many of my respondents talked about how they were encouraged either nicely or in rather an impolite manner to change their accents if they wanted to fit into academia. So at first it may feel that you've got imposter syndrome, and this is something that many, many people have, people across the board in terms of class. But I just found it's not imposter syndrome, it's more about not fitting in the institution.
And maybe this is a bit of a controversial question. Feel free not to answer it if you don't want to, Teresa. But I've even heard suggestions of bullying.
Oh, gosh, yes. Well, unfortunately, that is... So the thing with the book, right from the start, I wanted to make sure that I talked about the negative aspects that academics experience, and I'll come to that. But I also wanted to talk about basically what working class academics bring to academia. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the bullying, yes, that was rife. I think I'm just trying to think in terms of like percentages. I would certainly say at least 3/4 of my respondents talked about some experience of bullying in some way. Wow. And it wasn't just in terms of class. It was all, when I spoke to respondents from that awful phrase BME backgrounds, I definitely noticed that there was a racial element to that. And then also people with disabilities. There was, working class academics with disabilities. There was also some kind of, an ableist dimension to that. So bullying was rife. Everyone I spoke to pretty much had a story of where they've been treated quite badly by somebody from a middle class background.
Wow, that's some worrying statistics. Let's look at the more positive side. You said the kind of key focus in terms of what working class academics do bring to the discipline of education. What would you say are the main attributes?
So this was the part at first I did kind of despair about, thinking, okay, how on earth am I going to be able to talk about this? Because all the literature says that if you are from a working class background, you are in deficit. So we were talking about theories before. So once I started doing my PhD, I fell in love with the theories of Pierre Bourdieu, as many of the people that you've spoken to have actually referred to. But if you use Pierre Bourdieu in relation to working class academics, it would talk about how they lack in capital in so many different ways. So I really struggled at first to think, how am I going to talk about some of the positive aspects of being a working class academic? So I came across the fantastic work of Tara Yosso, an American academic, Professor Tara Yosso, who has written fantastically about other forms of capital and she focuses on people of colour, and she talks about various forms of capital. So one of them is aspirational capital, and an example of the aspirational capital that the working class academics have that I spoke to was very much how that they persisted through working in academia despite having these very challenging times. There was a quote from one of my respondents who said that middle class academics could not last a day in their world, meaning the working class academic world, but a working class academic could last many, many years in a middle class world. And it's about being able to navigate different areas. So very much about the aspirational capital. They were also talked about being role models as well. They could see very much that they were not just role models for other working class academics, but for the working class students. And again, that comes back to how I started off the book, as in very much working class students, by seeing the visibility of working class people in academia, can make them feel that they fit in. So that was just one example of what a working class academic brings to academia.
And what about actually within the classroom or the lecture theatre? Do you think there's any specifics there that the working class academic can offer?
Yeah, what I've noticed, so I definitely noticed that I've actually got a chapter called Working Class, that talks about like the teaching methods of working class academics, and I very much found that the way that they taught, it talked about bringing in lived experience into the classroom, and not necessarily their lived experience. So, for instance, rather than just actually doing a project on poverty, they would actually draw upon the experiences of people who've experienced poverty within their local area. They would also make sure it was very much about co-production as well. I kept on hearing the phrase co-production over and over. So it wasn't just about, as much as it's fantastic to see that working class academics bring the aspect of being a role model, it was also that they brought the aspect of actually being able to teach in a far more inclusive manner as well.
And what are the numbers like? Are the numbers of working class academics, is it increasing? I'm just worried about the economic situation and the cost of university and the cost of higher education and what's happening in the world, that actually we're going to lose that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So, for instance, I've interviewed, it's either 87 or 89 working class academics, so it's a fair few. And one of my respondents, and I think I start off chapter 7 by talking about this, is that due to the current climate, we could potentially see a lack of working class academics coming through, because we know that working class people tend to be put off by the idea of debt, and this issue that we could potentially see very few working class academics come through. So that was another reason. Once I started looking into the research, I felt it was vital to start to provide a picture of being a working class academic, because we may not see as many coming through.
That is a genuine concern, isn't it? I'm just thinking, particularly with the cost of university and going on to do a master's or even a PhD, how many people fund that, to be honest?
Well, yeah, because if you think about as well, and it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you do not have, so for instance, some of the people that I've had different people do masters with me, also to do their PhD with me, and the people that I like to really reach out to are the people that have had some difficulty in some shape or form, whether they be working class, whether it be about disability or any different form. And I think the reason that I would spot that and look out for that is because, being a working class person myself, I've experienced difficulty. At one time, as a single parent, bringing up 2 children on very, very little money, I understand. I've not forgotten those struggles, and I don't think I ever will. So I think is that the less working class people we have as academics, they're not going to look out for a working class student who potentially given a bit more support. Maybe sometimes they don't even need that more support, but they're going to look out for those students to try and help and support to get them through academia.
Yeah. And what are your overarching kind of conclusions in the book?
Well, I finished with just some ideas of how we can move forward. And I really do feel like, so for one, I've talked about that we need to reach out to like-minded academics. So we could reach out to other academics just easily, just by reading some of the work. And I really will plug some of the fantastic work that we have. I mean, I would say one of the books I always recommend to my students is the book by Lisa Mackenzie, Getting By. It's actually about a housing estate. I was actually from Nottingham, and that was a piece of work that I've really enjoyed reading. So just by reaching out, by reading work of Lisa Mackenzie, Diane Ray, Beverly Skeggs, Sam Friedman, Daniel Lorison, all these different people that have written about class in some shape or form. So even if you could not reach out to a person, you could actually be reaching out through people's work. I did recommend that people reach out to other working class academics, but I did put a note of caution to say that sometimes when people have talked about the class background, that has led to some difficult times for them. So I have stressed to be careful to do that. I think as well, we really do need to show solidarity to people that are not just working class. So, for instance, whilst the idea of being working class tends to be focused on the white working class, and that is, my book does not do that in any way, I think we need to reach out to other people who've been classed as being on the margins. We know already that people from BME backgrounds, I do hate using that phrase, by the way, BME backgrounds, it just puts people in a certain way that I don't like to do. But we need to reach out for people who are non-white to make sure that they are represented in academia just as much. Also, people with disabilities as well. We need to make sure our academia is inclusive as possible. That's really what I'm hoping that comes from this book, that we do promote academia to be as inclusive as possible. And I think finally as well that we need to recognise class inequalities as well. Considering we're a country that is supposedly obsessed with class, people still don't like to talk about it. And I did notice that when I talked to friends who would class themselves as being a middle-class academic, they liked to point out that they had also had a bad time. And it wasn't just tough for a working-class academic. But as I pointed out, I'm not saying that people from middle-class backgrounds don't have it tough. It's just that having the extra dimension of class brings even more difficulties.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you. So, where can people find out more? Where can they read the book or get in touch with you?
Oh, thank you. So I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter most days as well. I'm going to just look at my handle because, you know, when you end up doing one, you forget what it's called. Actually, it's called Dr Teresa Crew. I have to say, I purposely put it as Dr Teresa Crew because at times females can be seen as not, as high level as men. So I made sure that it was Dr Teresa Crew. So I'm on Twitter a fair bit. You could, if you typed in my name, Teresa Crew, banger into Google, you'll be able to find me there. And my book is due out. I think it's going to be due out mid-December. And I can't wait for it to be out, but it's also my baby. So I'm a little bit, oh gosh, do I want to let my baby go? I'm not sure yet. I might hold on to it for a bit longer.
Good. And do let us know when it's out, and I can help tweet it out as well.
I'll actually promote it on Twitter, and I believe that you will get, a discount of 30 to 40% as well. So I'll be promoting that on my Twitter account.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Teresa. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. And this is such a good thing that you do. So thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks, Teresa.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.